the important information we all need to know inside. You're going to hear from David Blume now. There's a wonderful book, Alcohol Can Be a Gas. And the bulk of this was written a while ago, was it not, David? How long ago was it?
The original book was written in 1983. But
83, folks.
Completely researched and rewritten for 2007.
Without further ado, a man whose time has finally come. I would have hoped it would have come in the 80s when the original material was put together. But now welcome, please, David Blume.
Well, I'm so pleased to be here with such great allies. And what we're talking about today is, on some level, very pedestrian. I mean, the first cars ran on alcohol. There wasn't any gasoline yet. It wasn't like there was a pool of gasoline lying around and someone said, gosh, wish we could run a car on that. It's like, no, we already had vehicles, and we were already running them on alcohol, which virtually every farm made in the United States. Pretty much every farm had a still, and that's how you made solvents and fuel for lighting and fuel for cooking. And if it got dark out there in the Midwest at night, the way you lit your home was with an alcohol lamp long before electricity was available. We didn't go from animal fat to petroleum overnight. We went to alcohol first. Alcohol is something we've made forever. I mean, some people say it's mankind's second oldest profession. So the city of Cleveland used to ferment 18,000 bushels of corn a month just to make the alcohol for its street lights. So this idea goes back a long way, even though you will hear people talk about ethanol as if it's a brand new thing. And you know, as Hunter was saying, Henry Ford was one of the biggest fans of alcohol. The first production line auto company, the Model T, was actually designed to run on both alcohol and gasoline. And as Henry Ford used to say, there were more stills in this country than there were service stations, so his cars ran on both. It was quite a simple thing for Henry to design a car to run on both, because alcohol and gas aren't tremendously different when it comes to an internal combustion engine. When we were at the Ford World headquarters, they had a Model T sitting in there in the lobby, and well, there was just one little thin velvet rope between me and it. So, you know, over I went, and we filmed a clip there showing how the motorist would just from inside the car, without ever having to go around the hood, be able to switch from alcohol to gasoline by turning a knob on the dash to go ahead and adjust the air and fuel mixture. Alcohol needs less oxygen than gas. And how you could tune the car where alcohol with the digital distributor on the steering column. Digital not meaning computer chip, but 5 digits of your left hand. So you would be able to adjust the tuning by listening to the engine, and alcohol being 105 octane could be tuned like a race engine compared to the 50 octane of Rockefeller's petroleum. So there was an enormous difference between premium and regular back in 1905. So it's not surprising when people say if it's such a good idea, why aren't we already doing it around the world? Well, I have 2 things to say to that, is that it already has been done around the world, all over the world, and now it's beginning to be done all over the world again. The other reason that I would bring up is it's not so simple as to have a good idea in capital when you're up against the largest corporations on earth. So there are some good historical examples we should all know about. For instance, we all think Prohibition was about the horrors of drinking alcohol and society rebelling against that. But when you take a look at the actual history of Prohibition, you find that Rockefeller funded the women's Christian temperance movement to the tune of $4 billion. And they passed a constitutional amendment, not a simple bill. It takes 2/3 majority to pass an amendment to ban the manufacture of alcohol, not so much the drinking of it. So it put all the alcohol fuel companies out of business, but it didn't stop drinking for a minute in this country. And it took over 13 years before we could come back to use alcohol as a fuel again. But at the point of Prohibition, Ford was promoting around the country alcohol-fueled distilleries, and half the cars in the country ran on alcohol on the first day of Prohibition. So we're coming around full circle where we are now embracing alcohol again. And it's not without opposition. We are constantly deluged with misinformation and half untrue information and straight out propaganda that blankets the airwaves. And it's amazing how hard it is to separate fact from fiction around alcohol. I'm sure we'll be happy to answer a lot of questions from the press because those myths are common among us, but we can talk about a couple of them right away. There was an incident in the 30s called the Agrol incident. Now, Agrol was a company that made alcohol in the Midwest. It had 2,000 stations across the Midwest selling alcohol at the pump. And it was taking a big chunk out of the oil company's revenue. The oil company said, how do we go ahead and get rid of Agrol? Well, the main customers of Agrol were the farming community, who saw the direct benefit of growing crops, selling them to Agrol to make alcohol, taking the byproducts for animal feed, and then using the alcohol at stations that they could buy themselves. And it keeps money in the community. That wasn't the plan for the oil companies. So they said, we got to get the farmers to abandon the fuel. And they knew this would be a tough job. So they went ahead and did the first media saturation bombing in the United States. They went ahead and delivered press releases on the same day to all the radio stations and print publications. Now, you got to realize there was no internet. This took thousands and thousands and thousands of kids to run these physical press releases to each source, so they all came out on the same day. And what it said was the Agrol company was secretly cheating the American farmer by buying Caribbean alcohol made from molasses and rum out there offshore. And the farming community said, well, it must be true. It's on every radio station. It's on every newspaper. And basically abandoned buying the fuel from Agrol in protest. And within 6 weeks, Agrol went bankrupt. The point was, though, that not one word of it was true. And it didn't matter how much Agrol could document how much grain they bought. And, they could have, people come in and photograph their plants full of grain, et cetera. It didn't matter. It was too late. So what we have today is the food versus fuel controversy. We've all been fed for the last 2 years just horse loads, truckloads, bulldozer loads of propaganda about how alcohol is somehow a morally bankrupt fuel, that somehow we're turning our country's food supply into alcohol and that's immoral, and that we're starving the rest of the world and driving up the cost of food for the American consumer. This is a very emotional issue, and it's very moral. Moral issues are hard to oppose because who wants to be thought of as an immoral fool? But the facts aren't there. In the last 3 years, when this propaganda has been going on, we have had a surplus in each year, a record surplus of corn. 3 years ago, it was 1.6 billion bushels. The year after that, 1.8 billion bushels, and this year we're heading for 2 billion bushels of surplus corn, even though the amount of alcohol we're producing is going up and up dramatically each year. Now, how can you cause the price to go up in a capitalist country if there's a surplus of the product we're talking about? Surpluses make the price go down. How can we be starving anyone in the world for corn if we have more corn than we can distribute and make go anywhere? We have it piled up outside of silos right now. So the story on the surface doesn't make any sense, but how many reporters have time to get on a plane and go to Midwest and see a football-sized, 100-foot tall pile of corn outside of the silos that nobody can find any space for? Yet we hear shortage and the raise in the price of food. In reality, the Congressional Budget Office, nonpartisan, got down to the basics on this, said that ethanol had less than a 1% effect on the rising food prices, and that the rising food prices were oil. Look at it, box of corn flakes. It's gone up more than 50 cents. Now, the corn that's in the box of corn flakes before the price rise of food was a nickel. The bag that held the corn flakes in the box is made out of what? Petroleum. That went up in price. The box itself is made from fossil fuel energy to crush trees into paper. That energy price went up, and the cardboard price went up from oil. The ink on the outside of the box is made from petrochemicals. By the way, each of these guys, the guy who made the ink, the guy who made the box, and the guy who made the bag, all made more money than the farmer who put the 5 cents of corn in the box. And of course, now you ship the corn from the Midwest, from where the corn is, to the coasts where the people live in boxes that are practically empty using fossil fuels. And now you've got a 50 cent increase in the price of corn, and it's blamed on ethanol. The price of corn during the price of corn increase, the effect on the actual price of the cornflakes was 2 cents. The Groceries Manufacturers Association raised the price of breakfast cereals 50 cents, and they won't bring it down now that the price of corn has inconveniently dropped back to pre-inflation levels, proving that corn had no effect on the price of food. So, you know, when you've got the American Petroleum Institute pumping out 10,000 press releases an hour saying ethanol is causing the price of food going up, and no one who's got the money to pump them out when the price of food goes down or the production cost goes down, certain things become consensus. They become a fact. They become accepted even though there's no data to back it up. What's really true? What's really true is that 90% of the corn in this country isn't fed to people anyway. It's fed to animals. So the 10% that does have something to do with people, 1% is used for corn flakes and it's used for corn chips. 1%. 5% of the corn starch, not the whole corn, is used for high fructose corn sweetener. And I would argue that that is not food. You know, now 3% of the starch, not the whole corn, is used for modified food starch. And that's used in gunpowder. Well, that's not food. It's used for starching shirts, you know, works pretty good for that. And it can thicken salsas, but it's an industrial product and it's not food. Now, as Hunter and I were discussing last night, you know, 1% of corn is very valuably used, and it is a human use, and it's made into whiskey, which I would argue is food. Okay. Now, but other than that, the rest of corn goes to feed animals. Now, you've all heard in the press, and everybody in the audience, 25% of the corn in the United States has been diverted out of the food supply and into the ethanol plant. Oh my God, it sounds like the corn was destroyed to make alcohol fuel. That's lying by telling half the truth. Yes, the corn went into the alcohol plant, but what came out was everything that was not starch. All the protein, the fat, the nutrients, everything that was good about corn is still there in what we call distiller's grains. So we take the starch out, just like they do with high fructose corn sweetener, we make alcohol from it, and the rest of it, the good protein stuff, is now better than soybeans for feeding the animals. And they gain just as much weight or more on the byproduct than they did on the original corn. So we get no drop in the food supply, and we get to take the alcohol out. So flip it over. What we're doing is making superior animal feed by fermenting the corn, and the alcohol is a byproduct that we ought to use in our own cars instead of ship it uselessly to other countries where cattle can't digest it. Cattle can't digest starch. You know, they're woody brush eaters, not grass eaters. So, you know, look what I just had to go through to explain to you why food versus fuel is not true, when propagandists can just say food versus fuel and you get it right away. It's very hard to put the science in front of people, but when you hear it, you go, oh my gosh, this makes so much sense. We had so much extra dried distiller's grains last year that the Chinese are now using my patented process where they're taking the byproducts from alcohol fuel and they're using it on their crops to stop buying chemical fertilizer and stop buying herbicides, because the byproduct from alcohol fuel, when used in my patented process, stops the need to purchase those things, which means they are not giving as much money to the oil companies to raise their crops. And those are the most expensive things in raising our corn crops. The American Corn Growers Association universally, acclaimed our patent and are now beginning to implement it across the country, where this is essentially ecological agriculture by putting the byproducts back in the soil where they belong and replacing the need for fertilizer from oil and from herbicides. So, and we have a very different licensing agreement for small farmers. If you're a small farmer and you want to use our patent to replace your herbicide and fertilizer with the corn byproducts, you have to go ahead and register with us and pay $1. But you can't buy anything from Monsanto when you do. Yeah. Okay, so alcohol fuel is more than just a way of saving us $1 or $2 at the pump. It's also a way of converting our agriculture to a more organic system, even with corn, which is right now horribly grown. But it allows us to use many different crops. Right now, if you're a farmer in the Midwest, you have a choice about what to grow. You can grow corn, you can grow soybeans, or you can grow corn. That's it. They're not selling, nobody else is buying quantities of anything. But if there's an alcohol plant at the end of town, they can buy sugar beets from you, they can buy Jerusalem artichokes from you, they can buy sweet sorghum from you, they can buy any number of crops. And so what alcohol does when done right is it diversifies American agriculture. And the American corn growers totally see this, because if you have a cornfield next to a cornfield next to a cornfield, and you get corn borers started here bothering the corn, they just go all the way down the road. If it's corn here, sugar beets there, Jerusalem artichokes here, sweet sorghum there, corn borers get this far and go, where do I go? Left or right? Up, down, I can't find anything to eat. So by mosaic planting our farmlands, we dramatically reduce the amount of pests that we have to deal with, which means the amount of pesticides that end up in our groundwater. So alcohol fuel properly done is a route out of industrial agriculture. And ecologists and environmentalists need to understand this. Looks like you had a comment there.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
The other thing we need to realize before we go to questions and answers is that alcohol is really easy to adapt to. Our current cars are run by computers and have been since the late 80s. And they're a lot smarter than our old, simple, carbureted cars, which had a mechanical device to mix the air and fuel. Henry Ford had a knob that you could adjust your carburetor with so that you could go from alcohol to gas back in the Model T. Our modern computers have sensors that take a look at how much oxygen's in the exhaust and can adjust the amount of air and fuel up to a certain point. So everyone out here in this audience today, everyone listening to this broadcast, has a car that, that is smart enough to run up to 50% alcohol without any changes whatsoever. That's what I mean. No changes at all. Just put it in the tank. Now, your computer probably will run out of brains if you do 60 or 70%, and it won't go that far. But we're able to convert cars to be able to use the full range of alcohol, E100, by giving the computer the extra brains it needs to be able to sense the whole range and make those adjustments. Those adjustments are already made in the factory for flex fuel vehicles. So my Ford Ranger, Ford 150 out there that Ford gave us to bring to this demonstration today, I don't have to think about what I put in the tank. I can put in alcohol, I can put in gasoline. The computer sniffs and figures out what's just right for the mixture, and the car runs without my having to think about it. That only costs about $50 per vehicle on the assembly line to make it that way. One of the things we're calling for today in this press conference is adoption of Senator Harkin's Senate Bill 1627. 1627 calls for a couple of really important things. It says that all cars sold in the U.S., whether they're made here or not, must be flexible fuel by 2014. There's no reason for us not to do it. All the companies that make cars make flex fuel cars either for Brazil or for Sweden or for here. They already know how to do this, and the parts have been reduced down to mostly software and a couple of bits of rubber. So there's no reason they can't do it. So Harkin's bill calls for them to get off the dime and make sure that they can do it by 2014. And what that does for American producers of alcohol, both small and larger, is guarantee that we'll have a future market, that the oil companies will not be able to shut us out of the automotive market because the cars will be able to run on alcohol or whatever fossil fuel they come up with. The other thing that's really important is Harkin's bill says you can mix however much alcohol and gas you want at the pump. These are called blender pumps, and some of us remember from our youth old Sunoco octane adjustment pumps where you could dial in what octane you wanted for your gas, and it would mix from the premium and the regular tank in the ground. What these new blender pumps will do for alcohol is have 105 octane alcohol in one tank, regular gasoline in the other, and you'll be able to punch in, do you want 30% or 50% because you haven't converted your car yet? Or do you want 80, 90, or 100% because you have converted your car? In other words, everyone would have access to whatever mix of alcohol they want. And this is what happened in Brazil over the last 7 years. Brazilians are a little bit more rough and ready than us. They didn't care if they had to go to 2 pumps to make their mix, first gasoline, then alcohol. So for Americans, we want to have blender pumps where you can just punch it in and do it once. But Brazil, because they took that initiative, all the auto companies switched to flex fuel. 85% of the country now runs on straight alcohol, which is half the price of gasoline. And they import not 1 barrel of oil for transportation in Brazil, not 1 drip. And Brazil is not a little country. You know, it's huge. It's just a little smaller than the United States. So it's an incredibly bad thorn in the side for the oil companies, because Brazil has proven that a nation can wean itself of oil, and economically, it's a powerhouse when its finances are not being drained, as Hunter put out, $2 billion a day to pay the oil companies for their black goo. So, black goo. I mean, if we look out the window today and we look at the hills, you know, in Los Angeles, for those of you who can't quite see it, well, you know, it's not a bad day. You can almost see the hills. But
A mile away.
what we're looking at, of course, is smog. What we're looking at is the emissions from gasoline vehicles. These are hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, nitrous oxides. With alcohol, we reduce those 98% to 100% over gasoline. I'll tell you a quick story. Years ago, I was down here in the 80s with Gordon Cooper, the aerospace engineer and astronaut. We had a big jet engine on a test stand. And we were working on making that jet run on alcohol really efficiently. And we bought a brand new pollution tester, you know, an exhaust gas analyzer. And back then it was as big as this table, you know, with tubes in it and everything, you know, it was just giant, you know. Nowadays they're just handheld. But we stuck the probe in the jet, we had our earmuffs on, you know, roared that thing up, and it's running on alcohol. And we thought, this new machine, it's like broken. It's like none of the needles are moving. So we take the probe out, and we bang it on the table. You know, I mean, this is how you fix electric parts, right? You know, we stick it back in, and then we did the second most common, you know, technique to fix it. We bang on the top, you know, and that didn't fix it. You know, we were going to go to lunch, so we took the probe out, we set it down in front of the engine as it was spinning down, and all the 3 emission needles jumped. So when we ran the jet on alcohol fuel, the LA air, which I can actually see, there's something not right about that, but I can see that air, and it would go into the jet engine, and it was dirtier than the exhaust that came out. The U.S. military is now taking advantage of this characteristic to put alcohol tanks in jets, so that when a smog-sensing missile, you know, the heat-seeking missiles, old technology, they look for the hydrocarbons now from the jet engines, they can slam over to alcohol, the emissions disappear, and the missiles get lost. Now, I hate to use war as an example of why we need clean fuel, although there's a lot of things about war that could demand why we need clean fuel. And how easy is it to make alcohol? So I can wrap this up and get to your questions. We have a still here, and I'm going to kind of stand next to it so you can see how it's operating, and I'll take this with me. It's so simple.
There ain't no revenuers around, are there?
Oh, believe me, we beat those guys back in the 80s. So
Taking that very far.
I'm not taking it very far, but that's good enough.
The leg of your chair.
Well, it's
Yeah, it's okay. So what we've got here is technology that we've borrowed from the oil companies. It's what's called a packed column still. So it doesn't look like the old moonshiner still with the, you know, copper coil or anything. But what we've got is a packing material in here that allows the alcohol and water vapor to condense and vaporize many times on the way up the column. I'm okay, guys. Yeah, I'm really okay. And as it goes up, when you come up at the break and take a close look, you'll see the alcohol vapor going up and the water flowing down. Eventually, what comes out of the top is 96% pure alcohol. In other words, it's 192 proof. And we condense it up here. You'll see it dripping off little by little and coming down into the flask at my feet. What's down in the pot here, this red color, represents the mash. Now that could be fermented donuts, it could be fermented tortilla chips, or, you know, in other words, anything with starch and sugar in it, or corn, or Jerusalem artichokes, or kelp from offshore, which I'll mention in a minute. The point is, we have alcohol down here that yeast have made, just like wine or beer, and then we separate the alcohol in a column like this. So this thing can make a couple of gallons an hour. A more practical size might be 100 or 200 gallons a day, but that's the basis of a small business, 200 gallons of fuel a day, especially as gasoline goes up past 3, goes to 4, goes to 5 and 6. Making 600 gallons a day of fuel would be pretty good, but you're seeing this technology is not very complicated. Now, the only control that this column needs is we have another coil right in here. And if we need to control the temperature to make sure we have pure alcohol, we can run the water through a coil right inside the column here and chill this area. And that, as you can see here, is causing some of the fluid to flow back down. And that keeps control of the whole column so we can get really consistent product. We can tell from the thermometer right here what the temperature is at the top of the column, and that tells us what the proof of our alcohol is. So, I want to show you this because, gosh, it's not rocket science. In fact, the reason why the oil companies are so terrified of alcohol is that any of you could operate this still. And in fact, any little computer chip could operate this still. So why is that so important? Well, cars are one thing. And I don't want to, Ed, are you going to go anywhere with deforestation or anything? Were you thinking of that?
What's that?
I'll finish this one little bit and I'll go back to you. Probably the most important thing we could talk about separate from war is really the 2 billion cook fires a year. I mean, there's 3 billion people roughly on the planet. 2 billion of them cook their dinner over 3 rocks, a fire, and a pot for food. And that fuel, it's renewable. It's wood. And people walk up to 6 hours a day, like 6 hours one direction, to get a week's worth of wood to come back home and cook for the week. And so cooking over that smoky fire indoors produces hundreds of millions of cases of eye injury and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease in women and children around the world. We are now seeing projects around the world where small villages, having stills a little larger than this, can grow a little bit of tapioca root, make alcohol, and cook over alcohol stoves. And now they don't have to walk 12 hours to get their cooking fuel. They're not looking at, health damage that is pandemic around the world. And instead of having to be on the road to get their fuel to cook, they're home to take care of their kids. You think alcohol and gasoline are simple issues about what's more expensive and what's running out and where's peak oil. But when you're, 5 years old and you can't breathe, in Ethiopia, and there's no health care and you can avoid it, you should. And so that's, where we get to with alcohol. Alcohol is a source of food. It is not a damage to the food supply. I'm going to give you a quick example from Archer Daniels Midland, which is not the best example. They're a big corporation. Their imagination level is pretty low compared to creative farmers, But Archer Daniels Midland used to make alcohol from corn. They take the byproduct from that, the dried distiller's grains we talked about. They'd go ahead and feed that to fish. They'd feed it to tilapia, which is a really good eating fish. We import 500 million pounds more than we buy. So, it's a big market here. And then the fish would eat that grain, but of course fish don't digest all of it, they poop out some of it. So then the fish water would be used to grow tomatoes and cucumbers and lettuce. And the Archer Daniels Midland used to go ahead and export 50,000 heads of lettuce a week from their greenhouses in Decatur, Illinois, in the middle of winter, because the excess waste heat from the alcohol plant kept the greenhouse warm. The carbon dioxide coming from the fermenting tanks sped up the growth of the lettuce so it would be ready in 23 days. And there was nothing about what they did in this little, very efficient, using the corn once, twice, and 3 times before there's any waste left over, that didn't make a lot of profit. The fish were 100 times the profit of the alcohol. And then the vegetables were 100 times the profit of the fish. So the money was in feeding people, and the alcohol was a route to get there. So what we propose in in our scheme of things, in our book and in what we're teaching around the world, is small-scale alcohol fuel production that is integrated with food production. So it's not food versus fuel. It's food and some fuel as a byproduct. And when we do that, we can feed everyone. You know, in America, we need, how do we run our cars? Well, this little kit is, you're going to see this in a little bit because Ed's going to work on one in his car, has a little computer in here. And we plug these onto your fuel injectors, as Ed will show you in a little while, and you're done. You can run on both alcohol and gasoline. Now, 30% of our oil comes from the Mideast right now. We could just put 30% of alcohol in the gasoline, stop importing oil from the Mideast, and we could be done with it, because every car can run on 30% alcohol without that kit. But when we put that kit on the car, we can now run on E85 or 100% alcohol, eliminate our pollution 98%, and eliminate our importation of oil from everyone completely within a few years. So to wrap it up, I'll say a couple of things. We use 500 billion gallons of fuel a year, 500 billion. To build an alcohol plant costs about $1 a gallon. So to build enough plants around the world to replace all the gasoline and diesel would only cost $500 billion. And a few months ago, that would have seemed like a lot of money. You know. So if we gave that, I'm sorry, no, we live in capitalism. If we would have lent that money to countries around the world to build their own alcohol plants, like we're talking about, where they produce fish and they produce mushrooms and they produce vegetables, you know, and all of that, everyone in the world, due to these alcohol plants, would have all the energy they need and all the food they need. And then the question is, what would be left to fight over if everyone had all of that? And the answer is it would only cost us, you know, yeah, we'd find something, right. But it would take less than $1 trillion to do that, and we've, you know, spent more than that trying to get our oil out of underneath Iraq sand already. So I would say that we, as a country, could get better value for our dollar and make more profit if we start working on renewable sources of energy instead of supporting what we've been doing. And with that, I'd like to go back to Ed and see if he has any comments or stuff, and then after that, we'll go to questions.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Big hand for David. The book again, Alcohol Can Be a Gas by David Blume. And you have to get this book. There's copies out here for everybody, right? Everybody who came gets a copy. And now I think, should we take questions before we do the retrofit? Let's see what questions people have from anything any of us have said or not said. We welcome and invite your questions right now. Thank you.
What would be the approximate cost in dollars of making alcohol fuel yourself? I mean, how much would you pay for a gallon?
So, Jim, you want to know what it would cost to make alcohol, say, on the farm scale or your backyard scale? Well, I used to make alcohol from donuts. And, you know, it's a funny thing about donuts. Cops can only eat so many, and then they got to throw the rest away. So I would take away a pickup truck full of donuts from a donut place every couple of days, and a pickup truck full of donuts would make me 100 gallons of alcohol. Because what's in a donut? They take all the good stuff out and leave the wheat starch and 10 teaspoons of sugar per donut. So it's pure fermentable carbohydrates. So I'd cook up the donuts, and I'd make the alcohol, and in a still that's about the size of just this half of the table, you can make about 200 gallons in a day. So that's enough to run a couple of people for a month. And I could do that with two pickup truck fulls of donuts. So how much did it cost me to make it, which was your question? About 30 cents a gallon. Now, it's not exactly true, because the government also gives me 65 cents a gallon in tax credit for doing it. And I get that check 90 days after I make the alcohol. So in essence, the government pays me 35 cents a gallon to make the alcohol when I go ahead and do it that way. Now, that's the low-cost example. That's, you know, waste materials, and it's, you know, the most ideal waste material. You could typically make alcohol for about $1. And in fact, alcohol is sold commercially right now from corn being purchased, which is a high-priced feedstock, for about $1.70 a gallon. Plus, you take off the tax credit, it's down to $1.20. So You know, all of you folks were in Los Angeles. Gas prices over Memorial Day were like $3.20 a gallon. But I just drove from Wisconsin in my Ford F-150 because that's where Ford gave it to me. We drove across the country and we never put gasoline in it. We stopped at alcohol stations across the country because on my website I have a list of all the alcohol stations in the country, so I used my own list, you know. And we got here and it was amazing because when we left, we were paying $1.71 a gallon at the pump for alcohol in Wisconsin, where they have 300 or 400 stations. And when we got to California, it had gone up to, oh my gosh, $2.50. But there was gasoline at $3.20, $2.50 versus $3.20. And then compared to Wisconsin, it's $1.71 there. So, you know, why, California, are you paying $3.20? It's because you are subsidizing the oil companies' depression, national depression of gasoline prices to basically discourage Obama, the rest of Congress, to do anything alternative about oil right now. They want you to just, you know, think everything is okay, but it's not. We're, as Hunter pointed out, we're running out of oil, and what will happen next is a crisis. We'll suddenly say, oh, you know, we miscalculated. We really don't have all this oil, but we've got some good ideas. If you'll only give us a few $1 trillion of your tax money, we'll take oil out of oil shale, we'll make it out of coal, we'll even take the forests of the Southeast and make it into green gasoline if we just, you let us have the forests, you know. And the point is, just like Wall Street crisis, just like many other crises, we're going to be so desperate for fuel suddenly that it's going to be hard not to give them everything they want. And the only thing that will stop that crisis is $60 a barrel alcohol made just like we make it right now today. And we can make more than enough to replace all the gasoline. Next question.
Could I just clarify something, David? What would be the cost, the upfront cost that you would amortize over many years, I assume, to buy a still, to get the equipment to do this in your garage, let's say, your farm or your garage?
Well, if you do it the way we talk in the book, and you have a friend who can weld, because, you know, this is metal work, and you go out and do like farmers do, which is look for used tanks and used stuff, being, in other words, clever and frugal, you can build a still for $1,500 or $2,000 that would make you 100 to 200 gallons every few days.
But there's nowhere on the internet you can buy one that they could ship to you already made. You've got to get a friend and a welder. And
Gosh, Ed, I'm glad you asked that.
Oh, this is not a setup, believe it or not.
Yes. It's just the logical thing, and that's why we're going to be doing it, is we've just actually started a company that will be manufacturing distilleries for people to go into the small business of alcohol and compete with the oil companies that make 200 gallons a day. And those who are interested in finding out more about that business, it's probably a discussion for another time because we have more questions to answer here. But yes, those will be on the market within the year.
Okay, thank you.
Nancy.
Not all of us are going to make our own in our backyard. Although I must say that I know that when we promoted this back in the 80s, that was the most responsive of all the programs that I ever did. How to make alcohol fuel in your backyard with your show. But those of us who want the easy way out, the average consumer wants to go to the gas station or the alcohol station or the fuel station, as we probably should start calling it. When and how are we going to get the oil companies to wake up? Have you tried to give this same presentation to them? And what has been their response?
Is that Nancy Perlman, by the way?
Yes.
Good to see you, Nancy, our leader, our green leader from the community college system. A big hand for Nancy Perlman.
Yes. And producer of Eco News.
I should say that at our Los Angeles Community College District, we are leaders in green technology, and we're trying to educate our students to have classes in this very kind of thing.
Yes, you are.
Well, Nancy, first of all, the oil companies are fighting additional alcohol stations right and left, and that's why we're very much in support of the new Senator Harkin 1627 bill, because it will force it down their throats. Now, in LA, there's a handful of stations you can already buy alcohol at the pump. And the DOE just gave a grant to a local organization to put in 55 more stations in Los Angeles. So that'll happen over the next year to 2 years. So you will have a convenience station in practically every neighborhood out here, but you'll have to know where it is. So check into our website so that you can find out where the stations are when they open.
And your website is?
Alcoholcanbeagas.com. Now, that's great, but you know, a concept in our book that we push for is community-supported energy, where neighbors get together on a piece of property in the neighborhood, or let's say the parking lot of a church or a dying strip mall that needs a little revenue, and you offer to go ahead and set up an above-ground, prefabricated alcohol station, you know, in a piece of unused asphalt somewhere. And you pay the owner of that land 5 cents a gallon to rent that space from him to have your neighborhood station, and that the neighborhood, for $200 or $300 each, owns the station. And they buy the alcohol direct at wholesale and sell it to themselves at cost, and the alcohol station earns you a 50% tax credit for putting it in. These are one of these little things that people should know. We hope with our organization to help be in a place where we can support community organizers to do that. So it takes one organizer to produce a station that'll fuel 100 or 300 people.
David, it can get even better than that. Braddock, Pennsylvania, Rust Belt town, went from 20,000 people to 2,000. It's a town that's dying. The mayor said, we're not going to die, we're going to go green. And so they're taking the vacant land where people have moved out and growing the feedstocks for biofuels, which is now keeping in business a 100-year-old third-generation oil company processing the local feedstocks into biofuel for the local community. This is something that any community can do for itself.
What's the town of Pennsylvania again?
Braddock, Pennsylvania. John Fetterman is the mayor.
And in Watertown, Pennsylvania, people started putting alcohol in their tank. It's only 2,500 people in town and 3 stations. So once one of them did it, all 3 had to do it or they'd go out of business. And then suddenly one guy put in a blender pump. The other 2 had to put them in to stay in business. And so now people in Watertown, nobody uses straight gas anymore. And an increasing number are converting their cars to straight alcohol. But everyone is using at least 50%. It took one guy, one person, to tell their neighbors in their community what they were doing and argue with one station owner to start it. And all this information is outlined in our book as a toolbox for those kind of activists. More questions?
Thank you for promoting the localness of the fuel kind of economy. I think that's going to be one of the most important drivers as we grow. But one question is, as it becomes this commercially viable thing on the large scale, what do we do about GMOs in that picture, and how does that relate to your views of the growing corn industry?
You know, that's a tricky question because as an ecologist, I have pretty strong views about GMOs. So let's say you're an alcohol co-op here in Hollywood, and you have to decide where you're going to buy your alcohol. Do you buy it from a farmer's co-op? Do you buy it from Archer Daniels Midland to get started, and then hopefully buy it from a local producer as you get things going? Well, that's interesting because Archer Daniels Midland buys no GMO corn, but they're a giant corporation. How do you decide which way to go? The farmer's co-op that's using GMOs, or the Archer Daniels Midland, which is a giant corporation who makes money by not buying GMOs and exporting its products to Europe. So,
Dave, now let me get this right. Archer Daniels Midland now buys no GMOs.
And never has.
That's not quite true. They were...
Oh, no, they have a probe system that they pull through rail cars, and if they get one positive, kernel, bang, the rail car goes back to the source.
Back in the 90s, they were buying undifferentiated corn, shipping it to Europe. There were a group of mothers in the United Kingdom who said, we don't want to feed GMOs to our babies.
Right.
So they
That's
went
right.
to their grocery store, Sainsbury's, and said, we don't want to buy GMO baby food. And the grocery store said, huh? And went up the supply chain to ADM, who said, nope, you get what you get. Come back down the supply chain, the mothers said, fine, we'll buy baby food somewhere else. The grocery store went back up the supply chain and started buying baby food that was not GMO, made in Europe. The Prince of Wales got involved, university professors got involved. In 1999, Alex Brown Deutsche Bank came out with an investment letter to its clients saying, do not invest in companies that trade in GMOs because they are going down. And that year, Monsanto was dismembered as a company, sold for the value of its pharmaceuticals division, and Bob Shapiro, who sat at my kitchen table and said, I want Monsanto to be a sustainable company. But in the same breath said, and we have the smartest scientists in the world, we don't need the help of you and Dana Meadows and Paul Hawk and a variety of people that we had pulled together to help work with that company to help them make the the transfer to being a truly sustainable company. Shapiro lost his job, the investors lost a lot of money, and now it's very, very interesting to hear that ADM has now decided not to buy GMOs because
Yes,
they were part of that industrial dissolution as well.
Pay attention to that story.
When you think you can't make a difference, remember those mothers in the UK. They have now transformed a company.
Yeah, because ADM said,
Very interesting.
hey, you know, we sell our products to Europe, they don't want it
Very
there,
interesting,
and
yeah.
we can make money doing it. So that's why they do what they do. Now, I got to tell you, things don't stay static. Remember I told you about the whole fish and the, you know, the lettuce and the cucumbers and the tomatoes at ADM, you know, and how great that was that a big corporation could do this hippie thing. They were delivering fish live to restaurants, trucks running on biodiesel. I mean, this is ADM, right? But there's a new president in ADM, and she came in and said, oh, you know, this greenhouse stuff is not part of our core business. So she had it all bulldozed, you know, so none of that's there anymore. The last place you can read about it is in my book. But you know where she worked for before she came on to ADM?
Monsanto.
She was VP of Chevron.
Chevron.
So what Chevron does not want you to know is that alcohol is such a green solution that reverses global warming, reverses climate change in general. It can make agriculture organic. It can reduce our smog 98%. We can employ 26 million people permanently if we make our own fuel. 26 million people. We can reverse all the job loss due to Ronald Reagan, Bush Sr., and Bush Jr., okay, with alcohol fuel. And it would be permanent. So there's a lot of agendas that are attacked by alcohol fuel, and that's why you will continue to hear propaganda about it. And when you hear it, you need to ask yourself, why am I being told something against my own self-interest? What is it that's really going on? Because you can't listen to alcohol negative propaganda without questioning it.
Can we take some more questions near the conversion? Tell me, Tom, where we're at time-wise.
We actually could take, I think, one more question. There's a gentleman here that's been asking. We've got such a great demo up on the roof. We've got to have time to get you all over to the cars and
Right.
outside for a minute. So we'll take one more question, and then we'll take about a 10-minute break and get everybody moved again.
And as we move, anybody wants to film the still and have me explain how it works up close, we'll do that for a few minutes just before we go over. Last questions?
Yeah, just wanted to make a mention, I guess on the CD that everyone's getting free with the book, there is more discussion about the still company. And my question that I wanted to ask about the sea kelp and how corn is not the best feedstock and the dead zones might be too long of an answer, but I'd love to hear you expound on that a little bit more, using sea kelp to clean up the dead zones and grow all our fuel just off of that.
Well, the question's about kelp being used to produce alcohol. Kelp is a big seaweed that grows all around the world, especially in cold water. And Norwegian fishermen have known for a long time that it makes great whiskey. So actually, kelp is made out of corn sugar or fructose. And what's great about kelp, which grows from the bottom into big floating, ropes with lots of leaves, is that because it doesn't have to resist gravity, it can put all of its energy into growth. So it can grow 18 inches a day. So a week's growth is like 10 feet. So in China, they grow kelp on big nets offshore, basically in the mouths of rivers where all the sewage comes running down the river and into the ocean, and the kelp absorbs those nutrients, takes CO2 out of the water and out of the air, and makes corn sugar. And we could actually produce 30,000 gallons an acre of alcohol from kelp in the ocean with no containment, no fancy glass columns, no any of that stuff. And if we did it in the 8,000 square miles of the dead zone, we could power the entire United States just with floating nets made of cellulose-based fiber for the nets. So we don't even have to use petroleum for that.
And it's not anchored to the seafloor, you're saying?
No, it's floating. Yeah, there are anchors that we put
Right.
down, but it's in deeper water.
But no
we
root
wouldn't want
system anchored to the seafloor.
Yeah, so we don't want to interfere with any native habitat where kelp normally grows. This is further out, and we clean up the ocean, we oxygenate the ocean, and we cool the ocean. So next time a hurricane comes, the water's cool, it's not so severe when it hits land. So our argument is the insurance companies ought to love to pay for this because it would save them a lot of money during the next climate-induced hurricane. Anyway, we could go on all day about this. I'm happy to talk with you about it. Thanks so much for coming. And we're going to take you out to some pretty amazing demonstrations, and you're going to get to see Daryl's Trans Am, which she hasn't seen yet. So
Kill Bill Trans Am, just to be specific.
thank you so much.
Take the book, read the book.
It's the fourth floor of the